this model, we're going to be talking about hip internal rotation and how that changes capsular space and range of motion overall in the hip. So in this example, we can picture that this is the femur here going down towards the knee at this end, and this is the pelvis. It's a ball and socket joint. This is a little bit of a crude model, but I think it'll serve to get the point across. So this represents, in this pelvis here, this represents this right hip here, where we have internal and external rotation, hip flexion, and so on. So what we want to focus on here is this red zone inside here. This is the space between the bones. This is the joint capsule space. So we're going to look at a setup here where there's not a lot of joint capsule space, and we're going to see how much range of motion that we have. So let's imagine that we can now lift our knee up into flexion, and this gives us this position here. Then we can move our leg back behind us into hip extension, and let's say that gives us that distance here. Now, within a given hip, within a given amount of space here, this is the range of motion that we have. The limiting factor is the relationship between the two bones. So the pelvis and the socket and the femur itself, the bones are just too close together. There's just not allowing very much room. So hip internal rotation is what we call the capsular path of the hip. So what that means is that as we actually rotate this hip forward and back, as we go internally, which is going to be in this direction, instead of just spinning in place like this, hip internal rotation actually increases capsular space. So it's like a corkscrew effect, a spiral, where we externally rotate and go deeper into the hip socket, internally rotate and go further out. So let's imagine now that we've acquired more hip internal rotation. So now we have more space, which I'll put with the green color here. And now we have more space between the bones in this hip. There's literally more space in the joint capsule. So now, if we were to come up and to do something like hip flexion with the knee coming up, you can see how much further we can go before there's a blockage here based on the amount of space in the bones. Same with the other direction. If we're going to move our leg behind us, as we go further, now the limiting factor is here, so this is a further distance than we had previously. So the moral of the story here is that the more space we have in a joint capsule allows for more range of motion, number one. And number two, that hip internal rotation is the mechanism to draw that femur away from the pelvis and create more capsular space. If you're looking for more range of motion or a deeper squat in the hip, one of the best things we can do is try to understand how much hip internal rotation we have, because that will be the first prerequisite for all the other ranges of motion, and that's the first place we want to capture at least sufficient movement. Otherwise, we're always going to be working with this lesser amount, and our maximum potential is going to be limited by how much space is inside the joint more than anything else.